We are commencing legal action against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her televised allegations, particularly the Oprah interview, have inflicted undue harm upon the royal family. An apology no longer suffices. The matter will now proceed through the...
The briefing was supposed to be routine, controlled, and sealed behind palace discipline. Then King Charles saw one name printed on the Privy attendance list: Meghan. In that instant, the room changed. Papers stopped moving. Aides stopped speaking. The monarch did not shout. He did something far more chilling. He closed the folder, looked toward the senior clerk, and cancelled the entire briefing before a single word could begin. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered that room expecting obedience, order, and the old rhythm of palace control. He had prepared himself for a privy briefing, a private high-level royal meeting where trusted officials discuss sensitive decisions before they touch the public world, and he believed every name on that attendance list had already been cleared through the proper channels. But then he saw Meghan's name. Not penciled in, not whispered through a corridor, printed, formal, approved. The king's fingers tightened around the page, and for one long second, no one dared breathe. This mattered because a name on that list was not a casual invitation. It meant access. It meant recognition. It meant someone inside the palace had allowed a deeply personal family wound to move into official royal space. William was waiting nearby when the silence changed. The prince did not need anyone to explain what had happened, because he knew his father's stillness too well. Charles did not slam the folder down. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked toward the senior clerk and said the briefing would not proceed. That was the moment the central decision became impossible to hide. The king cancelled the privy briefing immediately after spotting Meghan's name on the attendance list. The monarch felt blindsided, not only because Meghan's inclusion challenged the fragile boundaries around the family, but because someone had pushed that name through the system without warning him. William watched the faces around him harden with fear, and he understood this was no mistake of ink or typing. This was a test of authority. A senior aide stepped forward with a careful explanation, but even his voice betrayed him. Meghan's name had been formally typed, approved, and circulated through the palace channel before reaching Charles's hand. That revelation landed colder than the cancellation itself. The king looked down at the page again, as if the letters had become evidence of something larger than one meeting. William remained still, but the prince's eyes followed every movement in the room. Someone had wanted that name seen. Someone had wanted Meghan close enough to the center of power to force a reaction. And now that reaction had come. But before the palace could discover who placed the name on the list, everyone had to face the deeper question: what Meghan's presence would have meant for the people already inside the room. For Charles, the list was not just paper. For William, it was not just procedure. For Camilla, it was a warning that old tensions had returned through the most official doorway in the monarchy. And for Meghan, even absent from the room, the power of her name was enough to freeze the crown's machinery. One printed line had pulled every private wound back into public danger. Charles sat at the head of the table, with his hand resting over the folder, almost as if he could trap the name beneath his palm. The king understood what the crown's machinery meant here. The private system of aides, clerks, and royal offices that keeps palace decisions moving before the public ever hears them. That system mattered, because it was built to protect control, and control was the one thing the monarchy could not afford to lose. Yet Meghan's name had passed through it. Meghan was not in the room, but she had become the loudest presence there, because her inclusion suggested that someone believed old family wounds could be carried back into official royal space without warning. William stood near the doorway, calm enough to look composed, but tense enough to miss nothing. The prince watched his father's face, and he knew this was deeper than irritation. Charles felt betrayed by process, by the quiet path that had allowed the list to reach him untouched, and by the possibility that someone had mistaken his silence for permission. William felt protective in a different way. He was not thinking only about one cancelled briefing. He was thinking about precedent, about boundaries, about how one printed name could reopen a battle the family had spent years trying to contain. The future king saw the danger clearly. Once a name entered official procedure, emotion could become policy. Camilla did not speak at first. She watched Charles's jaw tighten and felt the meaning of the cancellation settle over the room. The queen consort knew this was personal, symbolic, and dangerous, because Meghan's name did not simply raise questions about attendance. It raised questions about forgiveness, influence, and who had the power to reshape the family's future. Camilla felt exposed, fearing the crisis could force the king to choose between strict family control and a public gesture of reconciliation he had not approved. Then a senior aide stepped closer and admitted, in a documented internal account later prepared for the household record, that the list had passed through more than one office before reaching Charles. The words changed everything. Meghan's name had not slipped through one careless hand. It had traveled. It had survived checks. It had arrived with quiet force. And when the palace began tracing the list back through its quiet corridors, one buried incident returned with devastating force. The name on the list did not appear from nowhere. It carried the weight of a ceremony few outside the palace understood. A private Windsor remembrance held months earlier, where one empty chair became more powerful than every speech in the room. Charles remembered it. William remembered it. Camilla never forgot the silence that followed. That ceremony became the hidden spark behind the cancelled briefing. Charles had noticed the chair before anyone tried to explain it away. It had been placed near the front, then quietly removed before the remembrance began, and that small movement changed the temperature of the entire room. The private Windsor remembrance was a closed family ceremony held to honor royal memory away from public crowds. And it mattered, because even private gestures inside the palace could become signals of who belonged, who was forgiven, and who remained outside the circle. Meghan was not there, but her absence was given shape by that empty space. The king later learned, through a documented household account prepared after the ceremony, that her name had been discussed as part of a broader reconciliation gesture tied to the seating plan. That knowledge stayed with him. William saw the removed chair differently. The prince believed restraint had been necessary, because the monarchy could not let private family pain dominate a solemn occasion meant to protect unity. He understood the danger of symbols. A chair was not only a chair. A place was not only a place. If Meghan's absence had been softened into official recognition that day, William feared it would become a precedent, meaning an earlier symbolic act that later decisions could use as justification. That fear mattered, because the crown survives through careful lines, and once those lines blur, every future decision becomes harder to defend. The future king carried that tension long after the ceremony ended. Camilla felt the room divide when the chair disappeared. She saw Charles grow quiet, and she saw William become still in the way he became still when he had already chosen his position. The queen consort understood that the ceremony had not healed the family. It had hardened them. Charles carried sadness from it, because exclusion always came with a cost, even when he believed it protected the institution. Camilla carried unease, because she knew grief could turn into policy if no one stopped it. Then the hidden truth returned with force. The new Privy list looked less like an accident and more like an attempt to reverse the damage from that Windsor ceremony. Meghan's name had become a second chair, placed back into the room through paper instead of presence. And once that buried argument resurfaced, Charles could no longer avoid the confrontation waiting just beyond the closed doors. The door closed, and the palace mask dropped. Charles did not summon a committee. He called William. No aides, no clerks, no protective language, just a father, a son, and a cancelled briefing lying between them, like evidence of a family war neither man wanted to name. The prince entered carefully, but the king had already made one thing clear. This time, silence would not protect anyone. Charles stood behind the desk for a moment before sitting down, as if even the chair carried too much weight. The briefing folder remained unopened between them, but both men knew what it contained. The king asked one question, low and sharp. How had Meghan's name reached an official list without his direct approval? An official list, in plain terms, was not a casual note. It was the formal record of who was permitted into a protected royal meeting. And that mattered, because permission could quickly become recognition. William did not rush to answer. The prince looked at the folder, then at his father, and said the danger was not only Meghan's name. The danger was what that name would authorize once it appeared inside procedure. Charles felt the words strike deeper than he expected. He had cancelled the briefing to protect control, but now the monarch feared something worse, that his own household had begun making emotional decisions around him instead of through him. That wounded him. William saw the pain before the anger returned, and for a moment, the future king looked less like an advisor and more like a son trying not to hurt his father further. Still, he held the line. He said one soft gesture, pushed through the wrong door, could undo every boundary the family had fought to keep steady. Charles heard loyalty in that. He also heard warning. Then the king opened the folder. He revealed, through a recorded private exchange later summarized for the household file, that Meghan's name had not stood alone. A notation sat beside it. One word: observer. William's face changed. The prince understood the meaning at once. An observer was someone allowed to attend without full authority. But in royal life, even silent presence could become the first step toward formal involvement. That was why the word mattered. It turned a name into a possible role. Charles tapped the page once and pushed it toward him. William did not touch it. The silence between them grew harder, heavier, more dangerous. This was no longer only father and son arguing over one cancelled meeting. It was the crown, asking who had tried to move power through a side door. But behind the anger between father and son stood a quieter force. The palace machine that decides what reaches the monarch's hand. In the monarchy, power does not always announce itself with crowns. Sometimes, it arrives as a typed line, a checked box, a clerk's initials in the corner of a page. Charles knew that. William knew it too. And as the list was pulled apart name by name, the palace discovered that the most dangerous decision had not been made loudly. It had been made quietly, somewhere in the machinery. Charles demanded the root of the list, before anyone could soften the truth. The king wanted every office named, every revision traced, every hand identified. The attendance list had moved through private offices, palace secretaries, and constitutional staff, meaning the people who help manage royal duties, official papers, and sensitive decisions before they reach the monarch. That mattered, because this was not a dinner card or a social invitation. It was a protected document tied to authority, access, and family boundaries. William stood beside his father with controlled patience, but the prince pressed harder than anyone expected. He said vague answers would only deepen the damage, because uncertainty was how pressure survived inside palace walls. A senior courtier stood in a side office with the list in his hand, and shame moved across his face before he spoke. He knew the palace valued control above comfort, and this page had broken both. The courtier explained, in a documented internal memorandum prepared after the cancellation, that Meghan's name had appeared after a late revision. Charles listened without blinking. William watched the man's hands tremble. The courtier did not call it a mistake. He did not dare. He said the change had been attached to a note marked "Family Reconciliation Consideration," and those 3 words changed the mood at once. Camilla heard the phrase and went still. The queen consort quietly asked whether someone had been testing Charles's willingness to soften, and the question carried more fear than accusation. She knew reconciliation could sound noble to the outside world, but inside the palace, it could become a weapon if it arrived without consent. Charles felt the same danger. The king did not reject healing, but he refused to let healing be used as a side door into royal procedure. William understood that line perfectly. The prince had spent years watching emotion become headline, and he would not let it become policy. Then silence settled again, sharper than before. Meghan's name had not simply traveled through offices. It had traveled under a purpose. Someone had tried to turn private family pain into official palace language, and now the words were sitting in front of Charles like proof. And once those words were read aloud, The cancellation stopped being a paused meeting and became the first public crack in a hidden royal struggle. The briefing was gone, but its shadow remained. Phones rang behind closed doors. Staff moved faster than usual. Aides who had spoken confidently an hour earlier suddenly lowered their voices. Charles withdrew to a smaller room and refused the next file placed before him. Camilla sat alone after the door closed. William walked the corridor with the expression of a man already preparing for the next battle. Charles gave the order without raising his voice, and that made it more serious. Every Privy material connected to the cancelled briefing had to be recalled, sealed, and reviewed under direct royal instruction. Privy materials meant the papers, lists, notes, and private records prepared for a sensitive royal meeting before any decision moved forward. That mattered because those documents were supposed to protect the crown from confusion, not carry confusion into the king's hands. Charles told the staff that no revised briefing would proceed until the origin of Meghan's inclusion was fully explained. The monarch had protected authority by stopping the meeting, but he had also exposed something painful. He no longer fully trusted the palace machinery around him. Camilla sat alone after the door closed. She removed her glasses slowly, pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose, and whispered that the palace had let the past back in. The queen consort knew why this mattered. Meghan's name was not only a family name in this crisis, it was a spark, near old damage, near public memory, near arguments no one had truly buried. Camilla felt uneasy, because one printed line had reignited divisions that had never disappeared. Charles felt that same unease from another room, and the king understood the cost of his own decision. He had stopped the briefing, but he had also started a deeper reckoning. William received the update in the corridor and became quietly resolute. The prince understood that the cancellation had created both a family crisis and a constitutional crisis, meaning a serious question about how royal authority is handled inside official procedure. He did not panic. He simply asked who had seen the earlier drafts. That question mattered, because if Meghan's name had appeared only at the end, then someone had changed the direction of the meeting late and deliberately. The future king knew vague comfort would not be enough now. The crown needed a clean answer. Then, an aide stepped forward with the detail everyone had feared. In a recorded staff conversation later entered into the household record, the aide revealed that a second version of the list had existed before Meghan's name appeared. Charles heard the words and went still. William's expression hardened. Camilla understood that the crisis had just shifted from shock to proof. So before the palace could issue a line, before advisors could soften the damage, father and son faced the one conversation that would decide everything. By evening, the noise had faded, and only the decision remained. Charles and William met without secretaries, without Camilla, without the ancient language of palace procedure protecting them. The king looked tired. The prince looked certain. Between them lay the cancelled list, the earlier version, and a question neither could avoid. Should the monarchy bend toward reconciliation, or defend the boundary it had already paid so dearly to draw? Charles placed both versions of the list side by side and stared at the difference between them. One page held the original names. The other carried Meghan's name like a wound that had been reopened by careful hands. The king understood what Privy briefing materials meant now. The private papers prepared for a sensitive royal meeting, where even a small change could shape access, authority, and family meaning. That mattered, because this was no longer only about whether Meghan had been invited. It was about whether reconciliation had been pushed into procedure without his consent. Charles admitted, in a recorded private exchange later summarized for the household file, that he did not want the monarchy to look cruel. Then he lowered his voice and said he would not allow kindness to be smuggled through a side door. William listened without interrupting. The prince knew his father was speaking from grief, not anger alone. Charles carried every boundary around Meghan like proof of something he had failed to heal, and the monarch felt the ache of that failure in the silence between each word. But William believed compassion could not be confused with access. He told the king that mercy had to be chosen openly, not slipped into a meeting list as pressure. The future king's voice stayed calm, Yet the meaning was hard. Access granted by surprise was not reconciliation. It was risk. Charles reached for a pen, then stopped. For 1 second, the monarch looked like a father before he looked like a ruler. William saw the hesitation and did not rescue him from it. The prince understood that protecting the institution sometimes meant accepting personal sadness, and that sadness now belonged to both men. The decision was painful, but it was clear. Then Charles signed the written instruction. Meghan's name was to be removed from every Privy briefing material connected to the cancelled meeting. The king was not rejecting peace. He was rejecting pressure disguised as palace process. William watched the pen lift from the page and knew the turning point had come. The boundary had been restored, but the shock could not be hidden forever. And by morning, what began as a private list had become a public symbol, splashed across Britain with a force no palace statement could contain. At dawn, the palace silence broke without a single official confession. Britain understood anyway. The front pages carried the shape of the story before the courtiers could control the language. One newspaper showed a stark black-and-white image of the palace gates, under the headline, "The Name That Halted the King." And outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered, staring at the railings as if history had left a note there. Charles watched the coverage privately, and the weight of it settled on him before anyone entered the room. The king knew the public had seen the result, not the wound. They saw a cancelled Privy briefing, which meant a postponed private royal meeting where sensitive decisions are discussed before they reach wider government or public attention. But they did not see the two lists. They did not hear the word observer. They did not feel the pressure hidden inside Meghan's name. That mattered because the monarchy depends on silence to protect its dignity. Yet silence now made the decision look colder than it had felt. Charles had acted to defend order, but the public saw pain without context. William remained composed when the morning reports reached him, but the prince's tension showed in the way he chose every word. He understood that reaction could split two ways. Some would see his father's decision as strength, proof that the crown would not be pulled by surprise into emotional compromise. Others would see Meghan's removal as another sign of a family still unable to heal itself. William knew both readings could damage the monarchy, because strength without warmth looked harsh, while warmth without boundaries looked weak. The future king had spent the night defending the line. Now he had to watch the country judge it. Camilla felt the emotional temperature rise before any official response was issued. The Queen Consort understood that private fractures had become public conversation again, and Meghan's name had become more powerful outside the palace than it had been inside the briefing folder. Broadcasters framed the cancelled meeting as a rare sign of internal strain breaking through royal discipline. Outside Buckingham Palace, one woman held a folded newspaper and said, in a street interview, "The silence feels louder than a statement." That single sentence traveled fast, because it captured what people sensed but could not prove. Then the palace released its controlled line. The briefing had been postponed for procedural review, but no one denied that Charles had personally halted it. The king read the wording once and set it down. William heard the same statement and stayed silent. Camilla knew the damage could no longer be hidden behind polished language. And when the headlines faded, when the cameras moved on, the meaning of the cancelled briefing finally became impossible to avoid. In the end, the cancelled Privy briefing was not remembered as a scheduling decision. It became the moment Charles drew a line with his silence. William defended it with restraint, and Meghan's name exposed the fragile place where family pain meets royal power. No crown survives by pretending wounds do not exist, but no monarchy survives by letting those wounds decide procedure. Charles understood the verdict before anyone dared speak it aloud. The king had cancelled the briefing to protect the monarchy from a process he believed had been compromised, and that choice now stood at the center of everything. The Privy briefing, a private royal meeting used to handle sensitive matters before they move into wider official channels, mattered because one unexpected name could change not only who entered the room, but what the room seemed willing to accept. Meghan's name had become more than a printed line. It became the symbol of unresolved pain entering official royal space without consent, without preparation, and without the honesty such a step demanded. William did not look triumphant. The prince stood beside his father with the quiet weight of someone who had defended a boundary and paid for it emotionally. He knew compassion still mattered. He also knew compassion without structure could become weakness inside the crown. Charles felt the same sorrow, but steadier now. The monarch had not rejected peace. He had rejected surprise. He had rejected pressure. He had rejected the idea that reconciliation could be hidden inside paperwork and then presented as destiny. That mattered because the monarchy could survive sadness, but it could not survive confusion at the center of its own authority. Camilla accepted the truth in silence. The queen consort knew the crisis had exposed how vulnerable the palace could be when private wounds moved through official channels. Yet she also understood that Charles had acted when control slipped, and that decision restored something the list had threatened to break. The king took the corrected list, placed it into a drawer, and closed it carefully. Then he looked at William and said, "Now it is clear." The prince held his gaze, and in that brief exchange, the final meaning settled. No surprise names, no symbolic observers, no reconciliation through hidden channels. The crown chose order over chaos, clarity over confusion, and painful control over dangerous sentiment. The name had shaken the room, but the king's final decision restored the line, and everyone inside the palace understood that it would not be crossed again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.